This is a 2-hour lecture given in 1994 by presenter Jeremy Lee, a South African-born New Zealander and professional speaker. It sums up everything we see today and makes particular focus on Anatoliy Golitsyn and his book New Lies for Old, describing the breakup of the Soviet Union as a ploy to placate the West and rebuild the dead centralised command and control Soviet system. We see today that result, the Belt and Road project with Israel in the lead, with Russia and China following, all products of the banking house of Rothschild, flooded with Russian and Ukrainian Jews, Soviet-era scientists, the refuseniks. Ironically, most of them don't even qualify as Jewish. This lecture is over 25 years old. It even describes the coming war with China. Please enjoy. Jeremy Lee.
Now, the subject that I've been given to speak on is the question of the New World Order and what it is. And I think the title is The New World Order, Seduction or Solution. And that is a very provocative address because the New World Order is hardly known amongst a whole lot of people. So broadly what I want to do is to divide what I've got to say into two parts. First of all, to try and give you some historical background on what the New World Order is and what is involved and how its overall structure has been developed over a considerable period of time. And then from there, we're going to come back and we're going to have a look at its impact and its effect and what it offers to Australia. And by the time we've got through that, we should have provided, I believe, certainly enough material for you to make some sort of decision about what you see as the future of this country and what part you have to play in it and what this means for your children and for your grandchildren, because all the things that are happening at the moment are of incredible importance for the future of this country. Now, the New World Order has really only just appeared as far as the general public is concerned. Most people had never heard of it until we had a war in the Middle East against Saddam Hussein. And there were major speeches made by President Bush and also by the Prime Minister of Australia at that time, Bob Hawke, that the coalition of forces that had been built together to wage war over the future of Kuwait in the Middle East was part of a program for a New World Order. So if you ask the average person, what do you understand by the New World Order, they would say, presumably it means a coalition of military forces that comes together for a particular action at a particular time. Now, that is true. That is part of the New World Order program. I might just tell you that what happened in the Middle East was only part of a program which at the current time involves 24 United Nations peacekeeping activities somewhere or other in the world. There's a great debate going on about their involvement in the Balkans at the present time, and they're also involved in other parts of the world, whether it's Cambodia or whether it's in Africa or wherever it happens to be. The idea of a coalition of international forces gathered together under the United Nations flag is part of the idea of a New World Order. That, incidentally, was one of the most incredible wars probably ever fought, for the simple reason that it went for a very short period of time, 43 days from the start of hostilities to the end of hostilities. It involved on one side a casualty rate somewhere between 150 and 200, and on the other side, nobody quite knows, but upwards of 300,000. 300,000 on one side, something like 200 on the other. And over the period of that 43 days, the expenditure on the war was a little bit under $1 trillion. That is $830 billion, And if you want to work that out, I think it comes to $180 for every living person on Earth today, spent in 43 days over a war that still is not ended, and we may see the hostilities continue. But that part of the New World Order program really is only one facet of a very broad program that has been unfolding for a long period of time. It the idea of this started right back in the middle of last century, 1848, which is 145 years ago, when a very small book appeared that certainly changed the whole course of human events, a little book called The Manifesto of the Communist Party, written by a man buried in London now in Highgate Cemetery, Karl Marx, which talked about a worldwide revolution, and it finished with the words that said, "The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can only be attained by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains." Well, the ideas expressed in that little book lay in gestation for the remainder of the 19th century and came together in 1917 in the middle of the first great catastrophe of this century, the First World War, when 1 year before the war ended, a cattle train moved through Germany containing revolutionaries who were unleashed into the Soviet Union and promoted the second overthrow that had taken place in that year. The October Revolution, under the guiding hand of a man called Lenin, established the first communist base anywhere in the world. And from there, that architect, and he was a genius, he might have been an evil genius, but he was a genius, the architect of the communist movement set his sights on the final goal, which he was quite clear ultimately was to be a world program. And broadly, he spelled it out. He said, what we're going to do, having established our first base, is to divide our program ahead into two parts. The first part is going to be concerned with breaking down the opposition, what he called the imperialist powers or the capitalist nations, which at that time were right at their height. The British Empire was at its height. It spread halfway across the world, and he said we will unshake and unseat the whole of that empire. And then having done that, having broken up the structures of the capitalist world, we will then swing into the coalition movement that is necessary for some type of world order to emerge out of it. And the whole of the first part of that program started in 1917. Lenin only lived a short time after that revolution. He died in 1924, but he'd done all the planning work which was then carried on by men like Stalin. And in 1936, they had managed to establish not only their base in the Soviet Union, but they'd established a huge international movement that came together, known as the Communist International, or in short, the Comintern. It was known popularly as the Comintern. And the Comintern in 1936 established its program, which contained three major parts. And those three parts were: one, we aim ultimately to socialize the economies of all the nations of the world. Two, we aim to bring about regional blocks or unions of the various groupings of those socialized nations. And then third, we want to amalgamate all those regions into one final world order. Now, if there's any doubt that the world order that Lenin was talking about was the same as the New World Order that is being discussed today, you've got to continue to have a look at how the communist movement, before it finally collapsed, involved itself in the planning programs that were being arranged after the war that is culminating in the huge debate going on at the present time. So from that period on, that is the beginning of the 30s, right through the Second World War, the program of revolution continued. There were special revolutionary training schools set up. Leaders from all the third world nations went back to train there. Some of them ultimately became communist leaders. Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya. Some of them left and ultimately changed their political views. One of the famous leaders who went through the communist training schools was Chiang Kai-shek, who ultimately became a Christian and ended up across that narrow strait dividing Taiwan from mainland China, confronting his former colleague in class, Mao Zedong. So it is a strange and incredible history. But by the end of the war, the first communist bloc that had been established in what was the Soviet Union had expanded enormously. It had taken the whole of Eastern Europe. And today here in Australia, you can meet many Australians who came from those areas who remember what happened. Czechoslovakians who saw their country engulfed in 1948 without firing a shot, white-anted from within, and suddenly the Czechoslovakians waking up and finding that the previous democratic system they had got had been transferred and changed into a totally centralized power structure that from there on completely eliminated all freedom. Or countries like Latvia or Lithuania, or the area that is now being the center of struggle in the Balkans, Yugoslavia, and the tremendous national fervor and ethnic feuds that are going on today, all of which really have their genesis in the history of this century. For example, Tito and what he did to both the Serbs and the Croats in that period really is being fought out today. So there is no such thing as an issue in 1992 that can be divorced from its roots or its origins back earlier in this century. But by 1952, it was generally felt by the communist movement that the first part of that struggle, the revolutionary side of it, was changing. Already the decision had been made in colonial powers to abandon their former colonies and to move out and to leave what used to be called newly emergent nations in Africa and Asia or Latin America, wherever it happened to be, which broadly today we often call the third world, nations which are struggling to establish reasonable economic systems. And therefore, a conference was held in Moscow at that time, 1952, which said the time has now come from changing from the revolutionary period that we've gone through. We've got to change into this new idea of trying to amalgamate all the crumbling forces of the world into some sort of social order. It was a very, very interesting conference. They had delegates from all over the world. The leader of the communist delegation that came from Canada to the 1952 conference later ended up as the prime minister of his own country, Mr. Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Very few people know that he was a communist leading a communist delegation to the Soviet Union back in 1952. Ultimately, incidentally, involved in quite a number of revolutionary activities in Cuba and the whole of that area. And from there, the first international discussions began to take place on something called the New World Order. The New World Order. And by 1974, the United Nations, which had been formed right at the end of the war, became the focal point or the instrument through which it was possible to foresee this New World Order coming to exist. And by 1974, the Sixth Special Assembly of the Sixth Special Session of the General Assembly of the United Nations made a formal declaration for one part of the New World Order, which was the new international economic order. And broadly, the New World Order has got part of it devoted to economics, part of it devoted to what you could call the social norms and rules of the new world that they're trying to shape, and part of it is to deal with the military side or the policing side of it, which is the bit that we saw in the Middle East against Saddam Hussein. And it was in 1974 that the United Nations made that declaration. The United Nations itself has got an interesting history. It is viewed quite often from two totally different perspectives. There is one quite legitimate point of view that what is needed is a forum for all the nations of the world to meet, to iron out their differences, and to see whether negotiation is a better way of solving world problems than fighting each other. Quite obviously, if that is possible, it's the way to go. There is another quite different view that sees the United Nations as an embryonic power mechanism which supersedes nations and which ultimately accumulates the decision-making process for the world that previously used to be the prerogative of governments like the British government or the Australian government or the New Zealand government or Europe, America, or whatever it happens to be. The Soviet Union, which was heavily involved in the creation of the United Nations, always saw that organization as being a body through which they could project the world order program. If you go back and look at some of the history of the United Nations, its charter was largely written by a man called Andrei Gromyko, who I suppose would be the longest serving foreign minister anywhere in the world. He was the foreign minister of the Soviet Union right from that period until the late 80s, when he was finally retired by Gorbachev. And there was a tremendous pressure from the Soviet Union to ensure that the headquarters of the United Nations should be based in the New World or in America. There was a great debate about where it was going to be. The United Nations now has a number of divisions, Geneva and Paris, of course, where UNESCO is based, and also New York, but the main starting point was New York, largely at the insistence of the Soviet Union, because they saw this as a bit of neutral territory which could be part of the ongoing program to penetrate what was previously the capitalist world. Very interesting, lot of history that most people know very little about. So, if you can get the picture of what happened, the communist world went through this revolution, the revolutionary period of breaking up the capitalist world, and then having broken its basic foundations, changed course to bring all nations, perceiving the United Nations to be the body to do this, into some type of coalition which ultimately would become the focal point of a new world order which they had always seen as the legitimate goal for the communist movement. Now, please don't misunderstand me by assuming that I am trying to say that the new world order is simply a communist movement. It is not. There was a tremendous involvement from a whole lot of other bodies in the Western world which saw the same idea in their own garb. There were people who believe in a new world order that has a capitalist form. There are people who believe in a new world order that has a religious form. So everybody who pushes towards the new world order idea tends to see the final outcome in terms which are acceptable to them. That is one of the difficulties. That if ever we got a new world order, there would immediately be tremendous conflict as to what shape it should be, what values it should reflect. So that was the situation back in, let's say, as we moved into the 60s. One of the most interesting things that has come to light recently was that in 1961, we had a top defector from the Soviet bloc who had been involved right in the decision-making process from the end of the war up to the period that he defected. A man by the name of Anatoliy Golitsyn, hardly known. But in 1985, he wrote and published a book which is probably one of the most prophetic books and the least read of this period in history. It was a book called New Lies for Old. And what he broadly described was the planning that had gone on in the Soviet Union between 1952 and 1961 about a period coming towards the end of the 60s or even in the mid-80s when they would begin to woo the West in the final move for a new world order. And he said, what we are going to have to do is to change the perception of the Western world towards its former communist enemy. And in order to do this, the whole image will be changed. We will have a period of enormous propaganda. We will have a peace initiative. We will bring down the barriers that previously separated us from the capitalist world. We may even dismantle the Berlin Wall. We will woo the West with talk of peace and friendship and relaxation. And this was written in 1985, which was about 12 months before Gorbachev appeared at the head of the Soviet Union. Very revealing. So in 1985, all of a sudden, a new leader appeared in the Soviet bloc who told the Western world, yes, I am a communist. I've always been a communist. But I'm a different communist. I'm a nice one. What we're going to do from here on is we're going to break the whole Cold War psychology down. I'm going to relax the rigidity of the communist power mechanism. We're going to have freedom of speech. We're going to have freedom of movement. We're going to allow differing views. And this was taken up by the West, which itself was exhausted as a result of this long, protracted period of the Cold War. Thank goodness communism is changing. In 1986, the Soviet ambassador here in Australia placed full-page advertisements, which very few people read, in the papers, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Australian, which talked about the new world order that Gorbachev was wanting to bring in. We want to be friends. We want international cooperation with regard to economics. We want a change in the Cold War, and the West wooed and accepted that message with alacrity. And so Gorbachev then left and went to New York, America, went through Britain, and was feted. It was one of the most incredible propaganda exercises probably ever seen. I read a report of how the visit of Gorbachev to the United States of America was set up. 2 Aeroflot jumbo jets full of Soviet personnel were flown into New York to set up his program. The theme of the program was simply human interest. There were to be no interviews with Gorbachev on international politics. It was all human interest. His wife went along with him, and for day after day after day after day, the interviews were simply on the grandchildren and the fashions that they wore in the Soviet Union and the type of lipstick that Reza Gorbachev bought in Russia and how she was shopping in the West, and how they had got married and how they had met and how they'd gone through college together. And it was absorbing stuff to a Western world that knew very little about what was happening behind the Iron Curtain at that time. And at the end of that program, there was an opinion poll run in America which showed that the Gorbachevs were more popular in the United States than their own president at the time. Now that is brilliant propaganda, to be able to achieve that. He was painted in Time magazine on the front cover as Man of the Decade, and was finally given the Nobel Prize for Peace by the United Nations. Now, this culminated in 1990 of August. And you could really say that this program that was set in existence by Lenin, and which had fought its way right through the Depression and right through the Second World War and right through that subsequent war period, culminated in a strange conflict, not only between two systems, but between two individuals. Perhaps I can just show you the validity of this by giving you the background to this little book, which was given to me by a trade unionist in New Zealand when I was lecturing across there in 1979. The book was being used as a major study source for all the trade union branches in New Zealand at the time, And I subsequently discovered it was being used here in Australia, particularly in what is broadly called the left wing. It was written by a top economist by the name of Ernest Dubinskiy, who was trained in the Soviet Union, but who was working in the United Nations. He had a job in a division of the United Nations called UNCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. He was part of a team of 400 Soviet officials working in that department. And the little book that he wrote in 1978 and printed in the Novosti Press publishing house in Moscow was the Soviet evaluation of the New World Order, which the United Nations had declared to be the program in 1974. And I thought when I was first given this book, well, the communists would be right against anything that came out of the United Nations, because they would perceive this to be a program which is furthering the capitalist cause. And I was astounded to find that when I opened this book and started reading it, it was quite specific. Mr. Ernest Dubinskiy, writing in 1978, said the agenda for the New World Order was first put on the drawing board by Lenin back in 1920. If we can persuade the nations of the Western world to release their national decision-making mechanisms and to transfer them across into international organizations, this will ultimately provide us with exactly what Lenin was talking about, the means to bring in a new world order, which is the ultimate in centralized power. So here was a Soviet evaluation of what was originally in the West claimed to be a Western program, the New World Order, that said this is exactly what we've always wanted, and it's exactly what Lenin was talking about back in 1920. And Gorbachev was the man who was picked to present the new image of communism to the West in order to provide the base where the whole Soviet bloc could be brought into the new world order that was being prepared. And he was undone by one lonely individual living in the United States, whose name is Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And he probably, more than anybody else, has shaped what is happening in the Soviet Union today. Solzhenitsyn was a man who was born at the peak of that Stalinist period. He was brought up through communist training schools. He was taught to spurn any idea of a creator or a god. He was absolutely convinced that dialectical materialism and scientific socialism was the way the world would ultimately evolve to some shining destiny. He moved into the army and became an officer. But then he began to come face to face both with questions relating to freedom and questions relating to the spiritual side of man. And he began to speak out on his disagreement, his growing disagreement with the establishment inside the communist bloc. And the price for doing that was to be isolated or tortured or imprisoned. And he ended up doing 8.5 years in a slave labor camp in this new... This was going on, the latter part of Solzhenitsyn's period, at the time when Gorbachev was preparing to come to power and bring the Soviet bloc into the New World Order. In the 8.5 years that he was in the slave labor camp, he finally became a Christian and has written extensively of his experiences during that time. While he was in the same slave labor camp, he wrote the first volume of the Gulag Archipelago without a pencil and paper. He's recorded how he did it in one of his most recent works called The Oak and the Calf, and the way he did it was with a box of matches. He had one box of matches in his prison cell, which he used to break into different shapes, and every time he could produce a different shape with these matches, it reminded him of a paragraph or a particular historical incident or a chapter that he'd written in his mind, and he came out of that environment finally with nothing but the matches and wrote that book in an incredibly short period of time simply by looking at the matches to remind him how he'd done it. And they didn't quite know what to do with Solzhenitsyn, whose literature was so profound and so majestic that it was not only moving throughout the Soviet Union, but was moving out into the Western world. They gave him the Nobel Prize for Literature while he was still locked in the Soviet Union. If they killed him, they would turn him into a martyr. And so they decided in the end to throw Solzhenitsyn out into the Western world, where he might be a sensation on media for a short while and then would sink into obscurity. So out came from the Soviet Union this lonely exile, who then began to speak to the West. And the message he brought from the Soviet Union is that you are going to lose this war because you've forgotten God. That was the theme that he produced everywhere. You've forgotten your spiritual value. You've forgotten the enormous heritage that you've got. And you might have to rediscover those things through going through the process of misery that we've gone through inside the Soviet bloc. And right at the end of this period, in 1989, Solzhenitsyn wrote a book which was really a letter back to the people of the Soviet Union. He wrote that letter just as Gorbachev was preparing to go to the Western world. 16,000 words, which has now been published in the West, but it first appeared in Pravda, and it went through what used to be known as the Samizdat press inside the Soviet Union, and it was a letter in Russia today to the ruble. You can find them in the Middle East or Indonesia or even Australia. The second thing is that inside the United States, their own internal debts threaten to destroy them. To give you some picture, this year in March, just the federal debt, not the state debts or the city debts or the private debts or the mortgages, just the federal debt of one government in America hit $4 trillion. $4 trillion. Nobody quite knows the difference between a million and a trillion. Let me give you a picture. If you went into your bank and were good enough to persuade your bank manager to lend you $1 million, and you asked for that $1 million in $100 bills, across the counter would come a pack about 7 inches thick. If you asked for $1 trillion, across the same counter in $100 bills would come a pack 4.5 miles high. That's the difference between a million and a trillion. Now take that 4-mile high pack of $100 bills and multiply it by 4 again, and you're now right up through the hole in the ozone layer and way out there. That is just the debt of the federal government of the United States. The total debt package of the United States is round about the 20 trillion. And now you're out into cosmic dust and satellites. And they have a strange idea that they're going to pay this debt off by exporting stuff around the world. So if you read today's Australian, they've now set up a new trade bloc inside North American countries, bringing in Canada, Mexico, the United States. They want to bring in a number of other Latin American countries, and Australia has just applied for that, to join that, because we believe if we got into that bloc, we can get enough American dollars into Australia to pay our debts off too. Every nation in the world now is trying to find some means of paying off what is broadly an insoluble debt. A world central bank, the phase-in of a new world money system to replace the existing currencies of the present under this world central bank. The third part of the program is something called the IPC, the Integrated Program for Commodities, under which the control of the production and distribution of the major foodstuffs, fibers, and minerals of the world would shift out of national control into the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which is a big body in the UN. And by the time you've gone through all that, the decision-making process for economics would move into the United Nations. The second part deals with the social order. It is the new value systems whereby men and women shall live in the world of the 21st century. And these are now being transposed out of the United Nations into every country that will accept them or endorse them or ratify them in the form of treaties and conventions. We have hundreds of them now into Australia. They always come out sounding absolutely beautiful. The United Nations Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination on the grounds of sex or race or marital status or religion. People say, what's wrong with that? Sounds perfectly logical to me. Who wants to discriminate anyhow? Forgetting that the original definition of discriminate was to choose. Why should anybody want to discriminate against women or men or people of another color or people who have a different faith system? And the fair-go reaction of the Australian is, that sounds reasonable to me. We're a reasonable people. So they ratify that convention, which comes in and is translated into law, and by the time it begins to work, it produces the exact opposite of what you thought it meant. It is now illegal to go to your own local newspaper and place a little advertisement in the classified section saying, I would like a married couple to come and work on my little farm or in my business. Because the word married is a form of discrimination against unmarried people. Is that what you thought it meant when you first heard it? The elimination, or let's say, the Convention on the Establishment of the Rights of the Child. Doesn't that sound terrific? We are right against any form of the exploitation or abuse of children. Why not have an international convention on the rights of the child? But by the time it becomes law, you discover that the rights of the child encompass the elimination of the rights of parents. In fact, there is a clause in that convention which says, parental discipline is a form of discrimination against children. Is that what you thought it meant? Now, what am I trying to say? What I'm trying to tell you is that there is gradually being introduced into every nation a new value system whose origins are a new religion which is replacing the old one. And the new religion is the religion of humanism. Humanism has been cited as a formal religion by the United States Supreme Court because it has a belief system, a value system, a manifesto, which is only another word for a gospel. It has its own preachers. It has its own collections, its own churches and organizations. It is at war with any idea of a supernatural God, which it spurns as being a form of superstition. And we are caught in the middle here in Australia as a nation moving out of its traditional Christian value system, even though we might not be Christian believers in many cases. The values have their origin in a Christian heritage that goes right back 2,000 years, caught in the middle in a situation where the majority now have no values, have not been taught any values, where the educational system quite deliberately says we are secular, we're not in the value teaching business, providing a fertile ground for the replacement of the old with the new that is to come in. And the tragedy is that those who hold still the traditional value system of the Christian faith do not even know that war has been declared upon them, and are certainly not out in the battlefield. And that is where we are as we move into the last 7 years of the 20th century. And we're going to look in the next section at how all this shapes and relates to the future of Australia, what it has done in the field of economics, and what it means for the Australia of the future.